My family said I failed. I'm sitting in the back row of my sister's promotion ceremony, watching her accept recognition for a career built on everything I never got credit for. The folding chair creaks under me. My name isn't in the program. They see me as the one who left, the one who didn't have what it took. If you've ever been erased while trying to do the right thing, if you've ever watched someone else get praised for a life you nearly gave away, then maybe you'll understand. If you're here, let me know in the comments. Drop a listening if this hits something in you. Sometimes knowing someone is out there makes it easier to tell the truth out loud. My name is Grace Whitmore, eldest daughter of a decorated military family, 3 generations deep in uniform discipline and unspoken expectations. To them, I'm the quitter, the disappointment, the cautionary tale they whisper about at holiday dinners when they think I can't hear. Some people just don't have the mental resilience, my mother told the neighbors after I left the service. Grace burned out, it happens. What they don't know, what they can't know, is who I really am. I'm a former explosive ordnance disposal technician. For 6 years, I led bomb defusal operations in places where the sand burns your lungs, and every step could be your last. I've cut wires while mortars fell around me. I've crawled through collapsed buildings to reach devices that could level city blocks. I've held the hands of dying soldiers and made split-second decisions that still wake me at 3 a.m. But you don't get medals for classified work. You don't get your picture in the local paper for missions that officially never happened. I didn't leave the military because I was weak. I was pulled from field duty after an explosion in Syria 2015. A mission in al-Bari that went sideways fast. 3 of my team didn't make it home. I did barely with a ringing in my ears that took months to fade and scars on my hands that my mother pretends not to see. No ceremony, no thank you. Just a quiet transfer to civilian intelligence work and a family that filled the silence with their own version of my story, the one where I gave up. My sister Rachel sits at the front of this auditorium in her dress blues, all polished brass and perfect posture. She's about to be promoted to lieutenant colonel, the golden child who chose the visible path. Army public relations speaking engagements, podcast interviews about leadership and resilience. She's never defused a bomb, never held a dying man's hand in the desert, never made a decision that saved 30 lives while the world burned around her. But she photographs well, speaks eloquently about sacrifice she's never made. The irony sits heavy in my chest, but I don't move, don't flinch. I learned a long time ago that dignity is quieter than rage, and truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. I sent birthday flowers to my mother with fake return addresses, Christmas cards from Maryland when I was actually stationed in places that don't exist on public maps. I watched from shadows as my family's life unfolded in neat public chapters where I wasn't written in. At my cousin's wedding last spring, they cropped me out of the family photo. To balance the frame, they said. Tonight I'm wearing muted gray. Nothing that draws attention. Nothing that screams for validation. Just quiet fabric in quiet tones, like the woman wearing them. But here's what they're about to learn. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room is the person no one bothers to see. Sometimes the hero isn't standing at the podium. Sometimes she's sitting in the back row, waiting for the moment when silence finally speaks louder than words. If this story reaches you, if it makes you feel less alone, please consider subscribing. It helps this truth go further. And if you've ever been invisible in your own life, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Because tonight everything changes. My name is Grace Whitmore, and this is the story they never wanted you to hear. The Whitmore family was built on brass and bloodline. 3 generations of service, each more decorated than the last. Our house on the edge of Fort Bragg looked like a military museum. Shadow boxes lining the hallways, commendation letters framed above the fireplace, dress uniforms hanging in closets like sleeping ghosts. My father, Colonel Alan Whitmore, earned his Eagles in Afghanistan. 2 bronze stars, a Purple Heart, and a reputation for never leaving a man behind. He spoke in measured tones and walked with the kind of straight-backed certainty that made junior officers stand straighter, just being in the same room. My mother, Sarah, was an Army nurse who'd served 3 tours in Iraq. She saved lives in field hospitals while mortars fell outside the tent walls. She could suture a wound in the dark and calm a dying 19-year-old with nothing but her voice. At home, she moved through our kitchen with the same steady efficiency she'd used in trauma bays, but softer, quieter. Then there was Rachel, Golden from birth, it seemed. 2 years younger than me, but somehow always ahead. While I scraped my knees climbing trees behind the motor pool, she practiced speeches in front of our bedroom mirror. While I learned to field strip an M16 from Dad's old manuals, she studied debate techniques and charm. She chose Army public relations straight out of West Point. Smart move. Cameras loved her sharp jawline, perfect posture, eyes that could convey both strength and compassion on command. Within 3 years, she was the poster girl for modern military leadership. Podcasts about overcoming adversity. Panel discussions on women in combat. Medal ceremonies where she stood beside generals, their arms around her shoulders like proud fathers. The kind of service that looks good in photographs. I chose a different path. Explosive Ordnance Disposal. EOD. The job nobody talks about at dinner parties because explaining it makes people uncomfortable. While Rachel was giving interviews about breaking glass ceilings, I was crawling through collapsed buildings in Kandahar, my hands steady on devices that could erase city blocks. There's no glamour in bomb disposal, no photo ops when you're cutting the right wire. Just silence when it works and nothing when it doesn't. Dad tried to talk me out of it. EOD is a young man's game, Grace. Why not intelligence communications, something that builds a career? But I'd already made up my mind. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the need to prove something I couldn't name. Or maybe I just understood that some jobs require people willing to be forgotten. The training nearly broke me twice. 90% washout rate. Days spent learning to think like a bomb maker, to see death in circuit boards and fertilizer. Nights studying blast patterns until my dreams were filled with wire diagrams and timer mechanisms. I graduated third in my class. Rachel graduated first in hers. Guess which one made the family newsletter? My deployments blurred together: 6 months in Afghanistan, 8 in Iraq. A classified stint in Yemen that officially never happened. I learned to read landscapes like bomb makers' minds, to see the disturbed earth where devices hid to move through hostile territory with the patience of someone who knew that rushing meant dying. Rachel's deployments were different. She embedded with combat units for photo documentation, interviewed soldiers for morale pieces, coordinated with media outlets to show the human side of military operations. Important work. Visible work. The kind that gets you promoted. By 2015, she was a major with her own office at the Pentagon. I was a staff sergeant with scar tissue on my hands, and a reputation for being the one they called when nobody else wanted the job. Then came Al-Bari, Syria, October 2015. Our intel said the compound was clear abandoned weapons cache routine disposal. 4-person team, 2 techs, and a demolition specialist named Martinez, who told jokes to keep everyone calm. The first device was exactly where intelligence said it would be. Textbook IED Russian components. Timer disabled. I disarmed it in 12 minutes. The second device wasn't on any map. We found it when Martinez stepped through what looked like solid floor and triggered a pressure plate that shouldn't have existed. The blast threw me 15 feet into a concrete wall. When the dust settled, Martinez was gone. Just gone. The other 2 techs were screaming. One had a piece of rebar through his leg. The other couldn't hear me calling his name. I spent the next 4 hours pulling them out while the building groaned around us, every sound promising another collapse. My radio was dead. My hands were shaking, but I got them out. Both of them lived. Martinez didn't. They flew me to Germany for observation. Concussion, they said. Acute stress reaction. Some burns on my hands that would heal crooked. Nothing that would show on the outside. I expected to return to duty in a month. Instead, I got a call from my commanding officer. Whitmore, you're being reassigned. Civilian intelligence, effective immediately. No ceremony, no commendation for bringing 2 men home alive. No mention of the 4 hours I spent crawling through a death trap to save them. Just a quiet transfer and a redacted file that made it look like I'd been rotated out for routine reasons. When I came home on leave, my parents asked the expected questions. How was the deployment? Good, I said. Quiet. The kind of answer that ends conversations. I didn't tell them about Martinez. Didn't mention that I still heard his laugh sometimes when I was falling asleep. Didn't explain that the burns on my hands came from pulling hot metal off a dying man's chest. Instead, I listened to Rachel talk about her latest assignment, a documentary about women in leadership roles. She was interviewing female officers about their challenges and triumphs. breaking barriers, inspiring the next generation. You should apply, Mom suggested over dinner. They need soldiers with real experience. Real experience. I almost laughed. But I just nodded and said I'd think about it, knowing I never would. Because how do you explain that your real experience involves watching good men die for intelligence that was wrong? How do you make that inspiring? A month later, the family narrative solidified. At a neighbor's barbecue, I overheard Mom explaining my absence from recent family photos. Grace burned out. Some people just don't have the mental resilience for military life. But we're proud of Rachel, she's really found her calling. Dad nodded along. Added that not everyone was cut out for the pressure. They weren't cruel about it. Just matter of fact. Like stating the weather, I was transferred to a desk job in civilian intelligence, analyzing overseas communications. Important work, they said. Necessary work. The kind that never gets discussed and never gets recognition. Nobody asked my side of the story. Nobody wondered if there was more to tell. They'd already written their version, and it was easier than the truth. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, while I was reviewing intercepted communications from a cell in Eastern Europe. 3 months of chatter about supply routes and safe houses, the kind of intelligence work that happens in windowless rooms with fluorescent lighting that hums like dying insects. My phone buzzed. Mom's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer. Our conversations had become exercises in careful navigation, small talk about weather and work. Nothing that required either of us to acknowledge the distance that had grown between us, like scar tissue over an old wound. Grace. Her voice carried that particular tone she used for announcements, measured, prepared. I wanted you to hear this from me first. I set down my pen and waited. Rachel's being promoted to lieutenant colonel. The ceremony is next month at Fort Belvoir. It would be nice if you came. Nice. Such a careful word. Not important, not meaningful. Just nice. I stared at the stack of transcripts on my desk, conversations between men who built bombs for a living, planning operations that would never make the evening news. Work that mattered in ways no one would ever know. Grace, are you there? I'm here. The ceremony is on the 28th, Saturday afternoon. We're having a small reception afterward at the officers' club. A pause, then almost as an afterthought, please don't wear that windbreaker. The windbreaker, navy blue, slightly faded with a small tear near the left pocket, from a piece of shrapnel in Fallujah. I'd worn it to Dad's retirement party 2 years ago because it was the only civilian jacket I owned that wasn't black. Rachel had mentioned it 3 times that evening, each comment a small knife wrapped in concern for appearances. I'll think about it, I said. It would mean a lot to your sister. Would it, I wondered? Or would it mean more to have the family portrait complete all the pieces in their proper places, smiling for the cameras that would document Rachel's achievement? I'll let you know. We hung up without saying goodbye. Mom wasn't one for prolonged endings. I sat in my cubicle surrounded by the quiet hum of analysts and linguists, people who spent their days translating other people's secrets. The invitation felt like another puzzle to decode what it said versus what it meant, what was offered versus what was expected. Rachel was being promoted to lieutenant colonel, the same rank I might have held if Albari had gone differently, if Martinez hadn't stepped through that floor, if intelligence had been better, if I'd been the kind of soldier who could smile for cameras instead of cutting wires in the dark. That night I pulled out my laptop and looked up the details. Fort Belvoir, Virginia. 2 hours south by car. The ceremony would be held in the post's main auditorium, capacity for 300. Full dress uniform required for military personnel. Reception to follow. I closed the laptop and walked to my bedroom closet. In the back, still wrapped in dry cleaner plastic, hung my dress blues. The uniform I'd worn exactly twice, once for graduation, once for a memorial service for a soldier I'd never met, but whose family needed to see military precision in their grief. The ribbons were still attached, a handful of commendations for service that couldn't be discussed in detail. Good Conduct Medal, National Defense Service Medal. Nothing that told the real story. Nothing that mentioned Albari or the weight of decisions made in seconds that echoed for years. I touched the fabric through the plastic. It felt like touching a previous life. The truth was, I wanted to go. Not to make a statement or demand recognition. Not to disrupt Rachel's moment or force conversations we'd all spent years avoiding. I wanted to go because somewhere under the careful distance and polite erasure, they were still my family. Because despite everything, part of me missed being in the same room with people who'd known me before I learned to disappear. But mostly, I wanted to exist, to take up space, to be present in a moment that would become family history, even if only as a footnote. I spent the next week thinking about it. Walking through the grocery store, I'd imagine sitting in the auditorium. Reviewing intelligence reports, I'd picture Rachel at the podium accepting recognition she'd earned through years of dedicated service. Different from mine, but earned nonetheless. On Friday evening, I made my decision. I pulled out my travel bag and began packing. Muted colors, charcoal slacks, cream blouse, dark blazer. Clothes that would blend into the background, that wouldn't draw attention or spark comments about appropriateness. Shoes with low heels that wouldn't click too loudly on marble floors. I left the dress uniform hanging in the closet. Some distances were too far to bridge with brass and ribbons. As I folded clothes into my bag, I thought about what I hoped to find there. Not forgiveness, I'd done nothing that required it. Not acknowledgement, I'd learned to live without it. Just presence. The simple act of being in the same room as my family while they celebrated something that mattered to them. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe it would have to be. Fort Belvoir looked exactly like every military installation I'd ever seen. Pristine lawns, geometric buildings, flags that snapped in the Virginia breeze with crisp authority. I drove through the main gate at 1:30 p.m., an hour before the ceremony. My rental car, looking civilian and small among the official vehicles and family SUVs already filling the visitor parking lot. No one was waiting for me. I hadn't expected anyone to be. I parked between a Lexus with military spouse decals and a pickup truck flying a Marine Corps flag, checked my appearance in the rearview mirror, and walked toward the main building. The April air carried the familiar scent of cut grass and diesel fuel that marked military bases, everywhere a smell that used to mean home. The lobby buzzed with pre-ceremony energy. Officers in dress uniforms moved with practiced precision, their families trailing behind in Sunday best. Children tugged at uncomfortable ties, while grandparents clutched programs and searched for familiar faces. I found my parents near the reception desk, Dad in his dress blues, despite retirement, Mom in navy blue with pearls that caught the fluorescent light. They were speaking with another couple friends from Dad's old unit, judging by the easy familiarity of their conversation. "Grace," Mom noticed me first, her smile automatic and brief. "You made it." "Traffic wasn't bad," I said, accepting her quick embrace that smelled like the same perfume she'd worn since I was 12. Dad nodded, his handshake firm but distracted. "Good drive down." "Fine." The conversation died there. The other couple glanced at me politely, waiting for an introduction that never came. After a moment, they excused themselves to find their seats. "Where's Rachel?" I asked. "Preparing with the other honorees," Mom said. "She'll be out shortly for photos." "Photos, of course." I followed them into the main auditorium, a cavernous space with red carpeting and rows of folding chairs arranged in military precision. The front section was reserved for families of the honorees, marked with small white cards bearing names I didn't recognize. Our row was third from the front, close enough to see everything, far enough back to avoid the cameras. People filled the seats around us, proud parents, beaming spouses, children who fidgeted with their programs. I recognized some faces from Dad's retirement party family friends, who nodded politely when they caught my eye, but didn't approach. Grace Whitmore, the one who used to be in the military, the one who didn't quite fit anymore. Rachel appeared for the pre-ceremony photos, radiant in her dress blues. Her ribbons formed a perfect rectangle on her chest, each one earned through assignments that built her reputation as a rising star. She moved through the crowd with natural ease, accepting congratulations and posing for pictures with the comfortable grace of someone who'd learned to be photographed. When she reached our row, she hugged Mom and Dad, then turned to me with the same public smile she'd worn for everyone else. "I'm so glad you came," she said, loud enough for nearby families to hear, quiet enough that I caught the slight strain in her voice. Before I could respond, someone called her name. A young captain approached with a photographer in tow. "Ma'am, could we get a shot with your family?" Rachel's smile never wavered. "Of course, Mom, Dad." They arranged themselves naturally, Rachel in the center, our parents flanking her like bookends. I stepped back instinctively, but the photographer gestured me forward. "Miss your family too, right?" She's my sister, Rachel said smoothly. She used to be in logistics, I think. The uncertainty in her voice was subtle but sharp. Logistics, safe, vague, nothing that would require explanation or invite follow-up questions. I took my place at the edge of the group, far enough to be included, close enough to be cropped out later if necessary. The camera flashed twice. The photographer thanked us and moved on. Grace works in intelligence now, Mom offered to the families around us, as if that explained everything and nothing at once. After the photos, we found our seats. The program listed Rachel's achievements in neat columns, awards, assignments, commendations that painted the picture of a stellar career trajectory. Under family, it mentioned her parents and their service records. My name appeared nowhere. A small girl, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and careful braids, slipped into the seat beside me. She wore a pink dress and white shoes that swung several inches above the floor. "Are you Aunt Rachel's sister?" she whispered. I nodded. "I am. What's your name?" "Emma." "I'm her niece." Well, her friend's niece, but she said I could call her Aunt Rachel. She studied me with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Did you ever do something brave like Aunt Rachel?" The question hung in the air between us. Around us, conversations continued. Families sharing pride, officers discussing careers, children asking when the ceremony would start. Normal sounds of normal lives celebrating normal achievements. I looked down at Emma's expectant face, her eyes bright with the kind of trust that assumes adults have simple answers to complex questions. "Once I cut a wire," I said softly. "And it worked. That's all." She tilted her head. "What kind of wire?" "The kind that stops bad things from happening." "Was it scary?" I thought about Martinez's laugh, about the weight of wire cutters and shaking hands, about the 4 hours I spent crawling through rubble while my team bled and waited. "A little," I said. Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. "Aunt Rachel says being brave means doing stuff even when you're scared." Aunt Rachel is right. The lights dimmed, signaling the ceremony's start. Emma turned her attention to the stage, but not before reaching over to pat my hand with small fingers. "I think cutting wires sounds really brave," she whispered. I squeezed her hand gently and faced forward as the color guard entered their flags, catching the stage lights like captured fire. In the front row, Rachel sat with perfect posture among her fellow honorees, ready to receive recognition she'd earned through years of visible service. I sat in the shadows where I belonged, holding the hand of a child who thought cutting wires was brave, surrounded by the quiet truth that some heroism never makes it into programs or speeches. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The ceremony unfolded with military precision. Honor Guard and perfect formation flags, presented at exact angles, the national anthem sung by a soprano whose voice filled every corner of the auditorium without strain. I stood with everyone else, hand over heart, watching the colors advance, with the same automatic respect I'd learned as a child on bases around the world. But something had shifted since Emma's whispered words. The familiar ritual felt different now, less like exclusion, more like observation. I wasn't performing belonging anymore. I was simply present. The rows ahead of me were filled with ribbons and brass officers in dress uniforms that told stories in colored fabric and metal, colonels with careers spanning decades, majors on their way up, lieutenants still shiny with new commission. Their families sat beside them, spouses who'd learned to smile through deployments, children who'd grown up saluting before they could properly tie their shoes. Real military families, the kind I used to be part of. I found myself cataloging the ranks around me, a habit from years of briefings, where knowing who held what authority could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The general in the front row with the Purple Heart cluster, the colonel with deployment ribbons that mapped conflicts across 3 decades, the major whose ribbon rack included commendations I recognized from classified operations that officially never happened. Warriors, all of them. People who'd made choices that mattered in moments when seconds counted. Rachel sat among the honorees in the front section, her posture flawless, even in repose. She belonged there, no question about that. She'd earned her promotion through years of dedicated service-building programs that connected the military with civilians, creating communication strategies that helped families understand deployments, managing public relations that maintained support for operations that kept the country safe. Different work than mine, but important work. The base commander took the podium, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in uniform. He spoke about the tradition of military service, about the sacrifice required to earn advancement, about the responsibility that came with increased rank. Standard ceremony language delivered with the weight of genuine belief. Today we honor officers who have demonstrated exceptional leadership, unwavering commitment, and the moral courage to serve others before themselves. Moral courage. The phrase settled somewhere behind my ribs, not painful, but present. How many times had I heard those words at ceremonies like this? How many times had I applied them to others while never considering they might apply to me? The individual promotions began. Each officer called forward their achievements, read aloud their new rank pinned on by family members who beamed with pride that belonged to them as much as to the promoted. Husbands and wives who'd held down homes during deployments. Parents who'd worried through every news cycle. Children who'd learned to be proud of abstract concepts like duty and honor. Then it was Rachel's turn. She approached the podium with confident strides, her speech cards held steady in manicured hands. The spotlights caught the polish on her shoes, the precise arrangement of her ribbons, the confident set of her shoulders. Thank you, General Morrison, distinguished guests, fellow officers, family and friends. Her voice carried clearly through the auditorium's sound system. When I was commissioned 8 years ago, I thought I understood what military service meant. I thought it was about individual achievement, about proving myself worthy of the uniform. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the audience. Professional timing honed through years of public speaking. But service isn't about individual glory. It's about resilience, about staying committed when the mission becomes difficult, about understanding that some people will always choose the easy path, but real strength means staying when others retreat. The words hit with surgical precision. Not quite accusation, not quite condemnation, just observation delivered with the kind of casual certainty that made it sound like universal truth, rather than personal judgment. I felt Emma's small hand find mine again, her fingers curling around my palm with unconscious comfort. Around us, the audience nodded along with Rachel's words, appreciating wisdom that sounded earned and honest. The military taught me that commitment isn't comfortable, that real leadership means making hard choices and accepting difficult responsibilities, that some people will walk away when the pressure increases, but those who stay, those who see their duty through to completion, those are the people who build something lasting. She wasn't looking at me directly, but the message was clear enough. The narrative had been established years ago, and tonight was simply its public confirmation. Grace the one who walked away, Rachel the one who stayed. I didn't flinch, didn't shift in my seat or tighten my jaw or give any external sign that the words had found their target. Emma's hand in mine anchored me to something simpler than family politics or old wounds. Just a child who thought cutting wires sounded brave, holding on to someone who had learned that the hardest battles were often fought in silence. The speech continued words about leadership, about service, about the responsibility that came with rank. Good words delivered with genuine conviction by someone who'd earned the right to speak them. Rachel had stayed. She'd built a career through consistent effort and visible achievement. She deserved recognition. But staying wasn't the only form of courage. Sometimes courage looked like leaving when the system failed you. Sometimes it looked like carrying classified burdens alone. Sometimes it looked like letting other people's versions of your story stand uncorrected because the truth was too complicated for public consumption. As Rachel concluded her remarks to warm applause, I found myself thinking about Martinez, about the weight of wire cutters in my hands, about decisions made in seconds that echoed for years, about the 30 soldiers who went home alive because someone was willing to crawl through collapsing buildings with steady hands and quiet determination. Different kinds of service, different definitions of staying. Rachel returned to her seat amid continued applause, her cheeks flushed with well-earned pride. The ceremony moved toward its conclusion. Final remarks from the base commander, benediction from the chaplain, recessional music that would carry us all back to our separate lives. That's when the doors at the back of the auditorium opened. A figure in dress blues entered, moving with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being noticed. Conversations quieted, heads turned. Even the base commander paused mid-sentence. The newcomer's uniform carried weight ribbons that spoke of conflicts most people only read about, rank that commanded automatic respect, bearing that suggested someone comfortable with authority. and his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency, stopped on me. 4 stars. Even from the back of the auditorium, the rank was unmistakable. General Hill, I recognized him now from briefings I'd attended in windowless rooms, where his name carried the weight of operations that shaped foreign policy. Theater commander, the kind of officer who made decisions that affected thousands of lives and never appeared in newspapers. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his gaze methodical as it swept across the assembled crowd. Colonels straightened in their seats. The base commander stepped forward with the automatic deference due to superior rank. But General Hill raised a hand, subtle but clear enough to halt the approach. His eyes continued their scan, row by row, section by section. Professional assessment that missed nothing, until they found me. The moment stretched like a held breath. His expression shifted: confusion, then recognition, then something deeper. Certainty, maybe, or surprise. He took a step forward, then another, his polished shoes clicking against the auditorium's polished floor with measured precision. Every step carried him past officers who outranked me, past colonels with decades of service, majors with ribbons that told stories of valor, captains who'd led soldiers through conflicts that made headlines. He walked past my parents, past the honored families in the front section, past Rachel herself, who had turned from the podium to watch his approach with growing bewilderment. The conversations that had resumed after his entrance died away. Heads turned to follow his progress. Even Emma's small hand tightened in mine, sensing the shift in the room's energy without understanding its cause. He stopped directly in front of my seat. "Wait," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. "You're Sparrow." The call sign hit me like cold water. I hadn't heard it in years, hadn't thought about it, hadn't missed it. But hearing it now in this place from this man brought back the weight of everything that name had carried. I looked up at him, this general, whose face I should have recognized but didn't. Time and distance had blurred the details of so many operations, so many voices over comms, so many faces glimpsed in crisis and never seen again. "You don't remember me, do you?" he continued, his voice softer now. "No, sir." The words came automatically, trained response to superior rank. He nodded slowly, his eyes taking on that distant look that came with accessing old memories. Around us, the auditorium had gone completely still. Even the base commander stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed, when a 4-star general had abandoned protocol to have a conversation in the middle of a promotion ceremony. "Albari," General Hill said. "Fall of 2015. 6 of us were pinned inside that collapsed market. There was a tripwire on the north wall. We'd been there for hours, couldn't move forward, couldn't retreat." The memory surfaced like debris from a shipwreck. Albari, the market, but not the explosion that took Martinez. This was earlier, a different crisis in the same cursed place. A rescue operation that had gone wrong when the building started coming down around us. "You found another way," he continued. "Came in from the west side through what was left of the vendor stalls. I remember your voice over comms. Just one line, 'Sparrows in the wind.' The phrase that had become my signature. My way of telling command that I was moving, that I had a plan, that they should trust me to do my job without micromanagement. I'd said it dozens of times across multiple deployments. I was the 6th man, General Hill said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The one against the back wall. You never saw my face. I was pinned under a beam, couldn't move, couldn't even see much of anything. But I heard you working. Heard you talking your team through the disarmament. Heard you tell us all to stay still while you dealt with the device. I remembered now. 6 soldiers trapped when an IED brought down half a building during what should have been a routine sweep. The tripwire was connected to enough explosive to level what remained of the structure. Standard procedure would have been to call in demolitions and hope the building held long enough for a controlled detonation. Instead, I'd gone in alone. Crawled through unstable rubble to reach a device I couldn't see properly, following wire by wire until I found the connection point. 47 minutes of work with my hands while 6 men held their breath and prayed to whatever gods they favored. My daughter had just given birth the week before. General Hill continued, his voice thick with emotion I hadn't expected. I had a granddaughter I'd never met, 7 pounds 2 ounces, born while I was deployed. He paused, swallowed hard. I have a granddaughter now. She's 6 years old. The auditorium was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning cycling on. Hundreds of people holding their breath watching this moment unfold between a four-star general and a woman in civilian clothes sitting in the back row. Her name is Grace. The words hung in the air like smoke. Emma's hand squeezed mine tighter, and I realized I was holding my breath too. General Hill stepped back, came to attention, and saluted. Sharp, precise, public. The kind of salute that meant something, that carried weight, that couldn't be ignored or explained away. I stood, automatically, muscle memory overriding conscious thought, and returned the salute. My hand moved with the same precision I'd learned 20 years ago, crisp and sure, despite the civilian clothes and the civilian life I'd built around the classified spaces of my past. The general held the salute for a long moment, then dropped his hand and turned to address the room. "We don't always know who saved us," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium. "Sometimes they're sitting in the back row. Sometimes they never get the recognition they deserve. But they're here among us, and we owe them more than we can ever repay." He turned back to me, offered a slight nod, then walked toward the exit with the same measured pace he'd used to enter. The room remained frozen for several heartbeats after the doors closed behind him. Then slowly, like a held breath finally released, conversations began again. Whispers mostly, questions, looks cast in my direction with new curiosity. At the podium, Rachel stood with her speech forgotten, staring at me across the distance that had always separated us, but which now felt immeasurably wider. Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Grace," she whispered. "What sparrow?" I sat back down, my legs suddenly unsteady, and smiled at her with what felt like the first genuine expression I'd worn all day. "It's just a name," I said quietly. "Just a name someone used to call me when I was cutting wires." The guest quarters at Fort Belvoir were standard military-issue beige walls, government furniture, and the kind of silence that settles over buildings designed for temporary occupancy. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still wearing the civilian clothes that had felt like armor earlier, but now just felt like clothes. The reception after the ceremony had been a study in careful navigation. People who'd ignored me for hours suddenly found reasons to introduce themselves, their curiosity poorly disguised as politeness. "You're Rachel's sister, aren't you?" the one General Hill recognized. Their questions probed for details I couldn't provide, stories I wasn't authorized to tell, confirmation of things they'd only witnessed but not understood. I'd answered with the same measured responses I'd learned to give at intelligence briefings, truthful but incomplete, factual but unrevealing. Yes, I'd served. Yes, I'd known General Hill, though I hadn't recognized him. No, I couldn't discuss operational details. Rachel had approached me once near the punch bowl, her expression unreadable. "We should talk," she'd said quietly. I'd nodded, but somehow the conversation never happened. Too many people, too many interruptions, too much space filled with the weight of years of careful distance. Now alone in the guest quarters, with nothing but the hum of the air conditioning for company, I allowed myself to feel the exhaustion that public recognition brings. Not triumph, that wasn't what today had been about. Just the bone-deep tiredness that comes from having old wounds suddenly exposed to light. That's when I noticed the envelope. Plain manila standard office supply sitting squarely in the center of the small desk by the window. No markings, no address, no indication of how it had arrived or who had placed it there. Just sitting there, like it belonged, like it had always been waiting for me. I approached it the way I'd once approached suspicious packages in hostile territory, carefully, methodically alert to details that might indicate danger. But this felt different, not threatening. Just heavy with the weight of information that someone thought I needed to have. Inside were 4 items arranged with the precision of someone accustomed to organizing classified materials. The first was a mission log, heavily redacted black lines obscuring most of the operational details. But I recognized the header, Al-Bari Market Complex, October 15, 2015. The date burned into my memory, not for the rescue that General Hill remembered, but for what came 3 days later when Martinez stepped through that floor. The sections that remained unredacted told a story I'd never heard in full. The operation had been larger than I'd known, multiple teams, multiple objectives, coordinated response to intelligence about a weapons cache that turned out to be more complex than anyone had anticipated. My role, reduced to clinical language in official documentation, was listed as EOD specialist, providing site clearance and unexploded ordnance disposal. Nothing about crawling through rubble, nothing about the 47 minutes spent disarming a device that could have killed 6 men. Nothing about sparrows in the wind, or the choice to go in alone when protocol called for evacuation and controlled detonation. The second item was a photograph, black and white, taken from above. Aerial view of the market complex after the initial collapse, showing the devastation that had trapped General Hill and 5 other soldiers. I could see the path I'd taken through the rubble, marked now with small circles and arrows that someone had added to show my route to the device. In the corner, a note in handwriting I didn't recognize: entry point, west approach through vendor stalls. Device location, north wall support beam. Disarmament completed 14:37 local time. All personnel extracted safely. Someone had documented everything. Someone had been watching, recording, preserving the details of an operation that had never made it into my official record. The third item was a handwritten note, ink, slightly faded, written on paper that bore the letterhead of the Pentagon. The message was brief. They never told the whole story. You didn't fail. You held the line. Some victories are too important to be left to public relations. A friend who remembers. No signature, no identification. Just acknowledgement from someone who knew what had really happened in Al-Bari and understood why it had been buried in classification and bureaucracy. The fourth item made my hands shake. It was a memorandum dated November 2015 from the Office of Public Affairs to the Department of Personnel. Subject line: Commendation Review, Staff Sergeant Grace Whitmore. The text was brief but devastating. Recommend deferral of proposed Bronze Star citation pending review of operational security concerns. Public recognition of EOD activities in current theater may compromise ongoing operations and intelligence sources. Suggest transfer to civilian contractor status to minimize visibility while maintaining operational effectiveness. PR impact assessment indicates family members already positioned for positive media attention in current assignment cycle. Family members already positioned for positive media attention. Rachel. They'd blocked my commendation not because I hadn't earned it, but because recognizing my work might overshadow someone else's carefully constructed public image. I read the memo 3 times each reading, adding another layer of understanding. My transfer to civilian intelligence hadn't been about my fitness for duty or my ability to handle the pressures of field work. It had been about managing narratives, protecting public relations strategies, ensuring that the right story reached the right audiences at the right time. I set the papers down and walked to the window. Outside, Fort Belvoir continued its evening routine, streetlights coming on, families heading home from the ceremony, normal life proceeding with the steady rhythm of military order. Someone had collected these documents, preserved them, waited 8 years to place them where I would find them. Someone who understood that truth has its own timeline, its own moment for emergence. Tomorrow I would drive back to my quiet life in civilian intelligence. Back to analyzing communications from people who built bombs for a living, back to work that mattered in ways no one would ever know. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, I had proof that my version of events wasn't the only version that existed. Someone had been keeping score. Someone remembered. I found Rachel in the officers' club bar, sitting alone at a corner table with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking. The celebration had wound down hours ago, but she remained in her dress blues, her ribbons catching the amber light from the overhead fixtures. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than a long day, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying weight you can't set down. The club was nearly empty now. A few junior officers at the bar, their voices low over beer and war stories. An elderly couple in the far corner, probably retired military, sharing a quiet dinner, the kind of place where conversations happened in measured tones and nobody paid attention to other people's business. I sat down across from her without invitation, placing the manila envelope on the table between us, like evidence in a trial neither of us had asked to attend. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her voice steady but careful. "Maybe I have." Rachel's eyes fixed on the envelope, but she didn't reach for it, didn't ask what it contained. The silence stretched between us, filled with 8 years of unspoken truths and careful omissions. "General Hill spoke to me after you left," she said finally. "He wanted to make sure I understood what happened today, what it meant." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "He said you saved his life, along with 5 other soldiers. That was a long time ago. He also said he'd been looking for you, trying to find Sparrow for years. Wanted to thank you properly." Her voice carried a note I couldn't quite identify, not accusation, not guilt. Something closer to recognition. He said when he saw you today sitting in the back row at my ceremony, it felt like destiny. I opened the envelope and slid the contents across the table. The mission log, the photograph, the handwritten note, the memo that explained everything. Rachel looked at each document in turn, her expression unreadable. When she reached the Pentagon memo, her breathing changed just slightly, barely perceptible, unless you knew how to read people who'd been trained to control their reactions under pressure. She read it twice, set it down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table with the precision she'd learned at West Point. "You know about this," I said. It wasn't a question. I suspected. Her voice was quiet, controlled. Not the details, not the specifics. But I knew something had changed after Al-Bari. The timeline never made sense. Your transfer, the lack of recognition, the way everything just disappeared. And you said nothing. Oh, what was I supposed to say? For the first time, her composure cracked slightly. That I thought my sister deserved better. That the system was protecting my career at the expense of hers. That every interview I gave, every speech I made about military excellence was built on the silence surrounding what you'd actually done. I studied her face, looking for deception or deflection. Found neither, just fatigue and something that might have been relief. "The truth," I said. "You were supposed to say the truth." Rachel picked up her wine glass, set it down without drinking. "The truth would have ended everything I'd worked for. Every program I'd built, every initiative I'd championed, every young woman I'd inspired to pursue military leadership." She met my eyes directly. "If people had known you were the one behind Al-Bari, no one would have listened to me anymore." The honesty was brutal in its simplicity. No justification, no excuses. Just acknowledgement of the calculation she'd made, my silence for her success. My invisibility for her platform. I never needed them to listen. I said, my voice steady, despite the anger that wanted to surface. "I needed you to tell the truth." "Would you have?" she asked. "If the roles were reversed, if speaking up would have destroyed something you'd built to help other people?" The question hung between us like smoke. I thought about the young women who'd heard Rachel speak at leadership conferences, the military families who'd been helped by programs she'd developed, the positive changes she'd championed in military culture. Real work, important work, built on a foundation of my erasure. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'd like to think I would have found a way to honor both stories. Yours and mine." Rachel nodded slowly. "You're right. I should have found a way." She gestured at the documents scattered between us. "Someone did. Someone made sure the record existed. Someone preserved the evidence. Someone who wasn't my sister." The words cut deep, and I could see them land. Rachel's composure finally broke, not into tears or anger, but into something quieter. Acceptance, maybe, or recognition of a debt too large to repay. "I can't undo 8 years of silence," she said. "I can't give you back the recognition you deserved. But I can stop participating in the erasure." "What does that mean?" "It means I make this right, however I can, whatever it costs." I gathered the documents back into the envelope, my movements deliberate and calm. The conversation was over, not because we'd resolved everything, but because we'd finally said what needed to be said. The truth was on the table now, ugly and complicated, but undeniably real. "Your granddaughter is named Grace," I said as I stood to leave. Rachel looked confused. "I don't have a granddaughter. General Hill does, 6 years old. Named after the woman who saved her grandfather's life." I tucked the envelope under my arm. "Sometimes the people we save remember us better than the people we're related to." I left her sitting in the empty club, surrounded by the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade and truths that could no longer be buried. 3 weeks after Fort Belvoir, I was analyzing intercepted communications about supply routes in Eastern Europe when my supervisor appeared at my cubicle with an expression I couldn't read. Margaret Chen, a career intelligence analyst who'd spent 30 years turning fragments of conversation into actionable intelligence, rarely visited individual workstations unless something significant was happening. "Grace," she said quietly, "you have a delivery at the front desk." The envelope bore the official seal of the Department of the Army, standard government issue, the kind that usually contained routine updates about benefits or security clearances. I opened it in the lobby, expecting administrative paperwork. Instead, I found a single sheet of letterhead and a smaller envelope marked personal and confidential. The letter was brief official language stripped of emotion, but heavy with implication. Service Record Amendment, Staff Sergeant Grace Whitmore. Previous personnel file has been reviewed and corrected per Protocol 47B. Service completion status amended from medical transfer to service honorably completed. Commendation recommendations have been restored to active status pending declassification review. Estimated processing time, 6 to 12 months. The signature was illegible, but the authority was clear. Someone with enough rank to cut through bureaucracy had made changes that should have taken years to process. The second envelope contained a handwritten note on personal stationery. Grace, I can't give you back 8 years, but I can make sure the record reflects reality. No press release, no public ceremony, just truth documented where it belongs. This is how it should have been from the beginning. R. I folded both letters carefully and tucked them into my jacket pocket. Around me, the lobby continued its normal rhythm. People coming and going, security guards checking credentials. The quiet hum of government work proceeding at its measured pace. That evening, I called my parents. Dad answered, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for unexpected calls. Grace, everything all right? Everything's fine. I wanted you to know my military record is being corrected. Some commendations that were delayed are being processed. A pause. Commendations. For al-Bahri, the operation in Syria. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear Mom in the background asking questions, Dad's muffled responses. That's good news, he said finally. Overdue, it sounds like. Yes, it is. We talked for another few minutes, careful conversation that stayed on safe ground. But something had shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition that their version of my story had been incomplete. 4 weeks later, I received another call. This one from West Point. Ms. Whitmore. This is Colonel Patterson, Ethics Department at the United States Military Academy. We'd like to invite you to speak at our annual cadet seminar on moral leadership. The topic this year is Service Without Recognition, Making Ethical Choices When No One is Watching. The invitation felt like symmetry. West Point, where I'd planned to go before choosing EOD instead. Speaking to cadets about the kind of decisions that define military character, but rarely made it into textbooks. General Hill provided your contact information, Colonel Patterson continued. He said you might have some insights worth sharing. General Hill. Still looking out for me even after our brief encounter at Fort Belvoir. Still making sure the right people knew about wire cutters and dark buildings and choices made in seconds that echoed for decades. I accepted the invitation. The trip to West Point took me through Virginia past Fort Belvoir, along roads I'd traveled weeks earlier for Rachel's ceremony. But this time felt different. Not like visiting the past, but like moving towards something new. The Academy's ethics classroom was smaller than Fort Belvoir's auditorium. Just 30 cadets, future officers, who would someday face their own versions of the choices I'd made in al-Bahri. Their faces were young but serious, marked by the particular intensity that came with knowing they were preparing for responsibilities that could determine whether people lived or died. I spoke for 40 minutes about decisions made without guidance, about serving without expectation of recognition, about the difference between doing what looked right and doing what was right when the two diverged. I told them about cutting wires in dark places, about the weight of responsibility that came with specialized knowledge about choosing mission over recognition when the choice had to be made. I didn't mention Martinez by name, his story wasn't mine to tell. But I talked about loss, about living with the consequences of timing and intelligence, and decisions made by people far from the field who never had to crawl through rubble to implement their orders. The questions afterward were thoughtful, probing. These cadets understood that leadership meant carrying burdens alone, making choices without perfect information, accepting responsibility for outcomes beyond their control. Afterward, as the cadets filed out with their notebooks full of observations about ethical leadership, I noticed someone had remained behind. Rachel sat in the front row, wearing civilian clothes instead of uniform. Her hands folded in her lap, like a student waiting for additional instruction. You came, I said. I needed to hear this, to understand what I'd missed. She stood slowly, her movement careful. You talked about service without recognition, about choosing mission over personal advancement. That's what the job required. I chose differently, she said. For 8 years, I chose recognition over truth. I built a career on what you sacrificed. I gathered my notes, organizing them with the precision that had become second nature during years of intelligence work. You built a career on your own work too. Don't diminish that. But I could have done both. I could have built something honest. We walked together toward the parking lot, past buildings that had trained generations of officers, past monuments to leaders who'd faced impossible choices and found ways to serve with honor. What happens now? Rachel asked. Now we do the work that's in front of us, I said. You continue the programs that help people. I continue analyzing communications that keep people safe. We serve in the ways we're qualified to serve. And us, as sisters. I considered the question while we walked. The anger had faded, replaced by something quieter but more sustainable. Understanding, maybe. Or acceptance of the complexity that came with family relationships built around institutions that demanded sacrifice. We remember that truth has its own timeline, I said finally. And that it's never too late to choose it over convenience. 6 months later, I'm back at my desk in the same windowless office, analyzing the same types of communications, from the same dangerous people, in the same unstable regions. The fluorescent lights still hum with that dying insect sound. The coffee is still terrible. The work is still invisible to everyone except the small group of people who understand how intercepted conversations about fertilizer purchases can prevent tragedies that will never make headlines. Nothing has changed, and everything has changed. The commendation came through last month. Not the Bronze Star that was originally recommended, but a formal recognition for exceptional service in hazardous duty assignment, resulting in the preservation of military personnel under combat conditions. Bureaucratic language that translated to you did something that mattered, and we're finally admitting it. No ceremony, no family gathering. Just an envelope in my mailbox, and a notation in a file that most people will never see. I keep the citation in my desk drawer next to a photo that General Hill sent his granddaughter Grace at her 6th birthday party. Gap-toothed smile and chocolate cake, wearing a plastic tiara that declares her birthday princess. On the back he'd written, "She wants to be a soldier when she grows up." I told her she's already named after one. These days, I teach. Once a month, I travel to Quantico to work with new intelligence analysts, young people who've learned technical skills, but haven't yet learned how to make decisions when the manual doesn't cover the situation. I teach them about pattern recognition, about trusting instincts, about the weight that comes with information that could save lives or cost them. Mostly I teach them about making choices when no one is watching. The most important decisions you'll make, I tell them, won't be in briefing rooms with senior officers and clear protocols. They'll be in moments when you're alone with information that matters and no guidance about what to do with it. When the right choice isn't the easy choice. When doing your job means accepting that you might never get credit for doing it well. Sometimes late at night when the building is empty, except for security guards and overnight analysts, I think about that red wire in Al-Bari. The weight of wire cutters in my hands. The choice between following procedure and following instinct. The moment when everything balanced on the edge of a decision made in silence, while 6 men held their breath and trusted me to get it right. I've cut a lot of wires since then. Different kinds, communication lines that needed to be severed, funding streams that needed to be disrupted, connections between dangerous people that needed to be broken. The tools change, but the principle remains the same. Sometimes the most important work happens in the spaces between official actions, in the decisions that prevent problems, rather than solve them. We don't always get the medals. We don't always get the recognition or the family photos or the speeches about heroism and service. Sometimes we get transferred to civilian jobs and learn to carry our stories in silence, trusting that the work mattered even if no one remembers our names. But sometimes we get to see the people who lived. Sometimes we get letters from soldiers who made it home, or intelligence reports that confirm a threat was neutralized, or photos of children who exist because someone made a choice in a dark place with steady hands and accepted the consequences. And sometimes they name their daughter after you. That's not victory in any traditional sense. It's not justice or vindication or restoration of reputation. It's something quieter but more permanent. The knowledge that in a moment when everything mattered, you did what needed to be done. That you held the line not for glory or recognition, but because holding the line was your job, and you were qualified to do it. If this story spoke to something in you, leave a comment. Let me know you're out there. Not for me. For you. Because sometimes all we need is to know we weren't invisible after all. Sometimes we need to know that somewhere someone understands what it means to serve in silence. Someone recognizes the weight of choices made without applause. Someone sees the value in work that matters precisely because it's never seen. My name is Grace Whitmore. I cut wires in dark places, and sometimes they stay cut. That's enough.